it's me that is responsible for all the data processing down the chain, basically. And these chains are increasingly very long. And the sorts of evidence to support the paperwork that is the contract is more paperwork. If the law is being broken by basically every company in Europe, we really have to question whether the law is working.
Hello everyone, I am Sergio Maldonado and this is Masters of Privacy, a set of interviews covering the intersection of marketing, data, privacy and technology with a clear goal in mind, which is redefining the relationship between people, brands and media around transparency and control. Which is to say, we're aiming for real customer centricity, or if you will, human centricity. We regularly talk to DPOs, CMOs, CDOs, and whoever else we find interesting and able to share valuable insights. So we hope you like it. Please do reach out if you have any ideas on future topics or speakers. Okay, we have Robert Bateman here today. He's a data protection writer, trainer, and consultant. He's published millions of words on the topic, as well as led panel discussions and interviewed key well-known figures in the space on stage at privacy conferences. Besides freelancing as content creator on the subject, he is an associate with Act Now Training and the subject matter expert with Heward Mills, a data protection consultancy. With Robert, who's here for a second time, after more than a year, we're going to revisit recent EDPB or European Data Protection Board opinions and guidelines, specifically around two main topics. The first one is the need for data controllers to extend their oversight of processors beyond the first line of contractual relationships, so including subprocessors and beyond. After that, we'll go back to Meta and its updated consent or pay model. So, charging people not to see ads, since they have just announced a third option as a response to the EDPB opinion on consent or pay. And we will have to make cross-references to their own, so the EDPB's guidelines on the scope or technical scope of Article 5.3 of the e-Privacy Directive. Let's go for it. Rob, thanks for joining me again.
Great to be here with you again, Sergio. Thanks for inviting me.
A pleasure. So a couple of things. One of them is the new opinion from the EDPB on auditing subprocessors after the Danish DPA raised that question on how far you should go further down the chain from your processor. Any thoughts on that or any ideas on the impact it will have?
So the opinion, like many EDPB opinions and guidelines and so on, I don't necessarily disagree with what they have to say. Their interpretation of the law seems pretty sound. There are some parts that appear to be a bit more practical, which we can come back to. Not a compromise as such, but a workable solution. But for the most part, it's very, very rigorous. So the EDPB identifies how far controllers have to go when inspecting, investigating, auditing subprocessors and sub-subprocessors and sub-sub-subprocessors, so on. Now, the GDPR's liability model is very much focused on the controller. We did have some interesting decisions recently about processors, but it really places everything on the controller. So that could be, me, my business with one employee, myself, using services provided by the biggest companies in the world, Microsoft, Meta, and so on. It's contingent. It's me that is responsible for all the data processing down the chain, basically. And these chains are increasingly very long. I don't know if you've ever seen PayPal's list of vendors. It's, I think, tens of thousands they had to declare it under some other regulation. Um, it's obscenely long. You know, it's unbelievable. You're just scrolling and scrolling. It never ends, basically. So these processing chains have become extremely long. We've got thousands of companies involved in most organizations' data processing, and the EDPB says that you basically need to have insight into every single subprocessor handling personal data on your behalf. Now, they set a minimum level of compliance with regard to all subprocessors. So you need to know the name, the location, what they're doing with the data, purpose, and so on. Which I think is kind of fair enough because people have the right to access information about them, about who you share their data with, but also that you should be pretty much across all the details all the way down the chain. So not doing a full audit of every subprocessor necessarily, but being in a position where you are assured that they are complying with the GDPR on your behalf. Again, legally pretty sound, but practically speaking, basically impossible, I think. Yeah. So also, I think it kind of highlights one of the problems is they refer back to the EDPB guidelines on this, published a few years ago, where they talk about what sorts of assurances you can have. You know, it's not enough to just look at the contract and say the contract has these elements, therefore the subprocessor is obliged to do these things, therefore we can assume they are. You have to ask them for evidence that they're doing these things. And the sorts of evidence to support the paperwork that is the contract is more paperwork. You know, it's evidence of certifications, audits. It literally is all paper-based stuff. So it kind of, I mean, it's not all that meaningful, I think. You know, you're assured that they're doing what's written in the contract because of stuff written in other contracts. But it's not unreasonable, legally speaking, as I say. I just think it's another example of the EDPB. Maybe, I don't know, they are accused of not living in the real world.
Yeah.
And I think this adds weight to that allegation.
So that's exactly what I'm saying. I see small marketing technology suppliers, and everyone is using a cloud provider, that's easy. They even have an SLA. And so when evidence is requested of them, the evidence is simply going to become another piece of paper or another form, some questionnaire that someone is sending over. I see a lot of people trying to do what I've been trying to do, which is recycling a form. You do it once, and hopefully some people will stick to the same schema. And it doesn't work because then you're going to have another junior analyst, another junior, team member at the DPO's office at some large enterprise, and they're going to demand that you put the time going through, again, another questionnaire. If now that has to be expanded to second degree, third degree, I don't know how that's going to work.
I think there is some, there is some value in the questionnaires, and I conduct some of these sorts of exercises on behalf of consultancies and so on. But it's really more about trying to get the house in order, trying to understand the scope of their compliance obligations, trying to map out what types of data are processed and so on. It doesn't really prove very much per se. And the bottom line with the EDPB is that you should be kind of randomly sampling your subprocessors. You should have a really good overview of where the data goes and so on. I mean, I guess that's not entirely unachievable. I don't know how Microsoft would react if I decided to audit them, though. I mean, it just seems like we perhaps need to, in the medium long term, policy wise, shift to a slightly different model of accountability because it is upside down. And that's an issue, I think, because it means there's much less accountability on the actors with the most resources in the chain. You and I are both involved in a discussion on LinkedIn today about trying to find a solution for sending newsletters. And I had this problem myself. It was during the Schrems 2 sort of dark age where basically nothing was compliant with Chapter 5 GDPR. And I just couldn't find anything. So if the law is being broken by basically every company in Europe, we really have to question whether the law is working or written the right way. I've never actually publicly made this analogy, but I think of the law, the war on drugs that everyone hates. You know, people take drugs, people sell drugs, we know it, and prohibition has its place, but I think society recognizes that we need a slightly more sort of holistic and a bit more compromise and a slightly different, more liberal approach. If any kind of law is being broken, you know, over and over again by millions of people, you have to question whether it's whether it's the right way to regulate.
Yeah. So Meta just offered a third option. So there's plan A, where you pay, and now it's cheaper, and it's like €6 or a bit less, or €6 and €8, depending on whether you're using desktop or the mobile app. Then you've got plan B, which is that you accept behavioral targeting as it has been all along on Instagram and Facebook. And now there's a new method, there's a new plan C, which is these unskippable ads. And they're saying they're going to compensate. So Meta, in their blog post, they said, we're going to compensate the lack of depth with reach, so that you will have more people seeing an ad and they'll be taking your time, a bit like, I assume, YouTube ads, where you have to wait for a while before you skip this ad. So now we have this third method. What's your first impression of that?
It's interesting that, to me, that Meta appears to be responding to an EDPB opinion again. There, what was it? Guidelines. Some EDPB document about consent or pay in large online platforms. This category of company that they invented. That I found a little bit surprising, because when they switched over to consent or pay in the first place, they were being hounded by the Norwegian Data Protection Authority, for example. They were getting €87,000 a day fines or something from them. Obviously, small change, but would incentivize most companies. But they didn't mention that. They only mentioned the CJEU and the Digital Markets Act. So they appear to be trying to meet the EDPB's expectations by creating this new model that provides an equivalent alternative without behavioral advertising, as the EDPB termed it in that opinion. And the EDPB has responded quite warmly to this, informally, but they did put out a statement saying they're very pleased to see this kind of further options. I think they're going to accept it, actually. I think they're going to back off the EDPB. I think it looks like, from that statement from Anna Tallis, the chair, it looks like this might be enough to satisfy them. As for whether it's good or bad for Facebook users, I mean, I find it quite hard, and I haven't really thought properly about this, to distinguish this from what YouTube do, for example. No one really seems to object to YouTube. I mean, I pay for YouTube Premium because it gets rid of the ads, and you can play it with the screen off. Is that so different? I mean, you have unskippable ads on YouTube. I don't remember anyone getting particularly upset about that. So Schrems doesn't like this approach, because he quite reasonably says it's a way to annoy people into consenting. But it seems like a fairly reasonable compromise to me, if I'm honest. I mean, if the EU doesn't like this model, this business model, I really think they should just go ahead and ban it. You know, that's trying to badger them into closing down their business, you know, by regulations here and interpretations there and judgments and around the edges, I don't think it's a good way to go about regulating large platforms either. And of course, they won't do that because people in the EU like using Facebook and Instagram. And in my view, they have a right to use it. And if regulation leads to it going away, then it really needs to be properly legislated. You know, people should be able to feed into that, and European Parliament should be involved, and so on. So I think, you know, it's not a bad compromise, to be honest. It seems like they're trying to be a bit more accommodating, and I think the EDPB might go along with it.
I assume most people, yeah, will just accept the current model because nobody wants to waste time.
I will. I wouldn't pay for it, and I don't really want unskippable ads. And from this is just for me, though. You know, I'm not saying it's the same for everyone. People have different risk profiles, different appetites. I personally, you know, I don't really care that much. So, you know, I do take some steps. I use Brave browser start page and so on. It makes me feel a bit better, but there are no. That's very very easy. You know, I don't. Everyone should do that. I think if they are at all worried, because it takes 5 seconds. I don't really think the trade-off is worth it in other instances. But yeah, I think most people will just go ahead and consent because that's kind of what they want, Meta wants, and they don't really mind. Even those who understand it, many of them just don't really mind personalized advertising.
Yeah, that's the thing. And so I want to see the impact of this on the other side, you know, because we're waiting for another set of guidelines on consent or pay. In theory, applying to non-large online platforms, this concept, as you said, that they made up the last time. And so that would be the guidelines for publishers who are using this kind of consent that you and I already talked about last time, so over a year ago, where I do not believe that's free consent, but there are going to be some guidelines. There's going to be some guidelines. So that means they're legitimizing that as it applies to the publisher. So now we're going to have a clear delta here where Meta or the platforms are becoming more, respectful in a way, because you've got this model. And at the same time, you have the open market. For some of the reasons that are external to data protection, they're going to be allowed to do consent or pay. And then if you consent, and let's call it consent for now, so you do not pay, the level of intrusiveness and of profiling and the amount of parties participating in the profiling is going to be much larger. So this new option is going to open a dilemma, and that's where I wanted to bring this idea of the drags. The way I see it, let me lay it out. So what I think is the one thing I've experienced is that marketers go with the flow. So whoever is buying media, especially in the large enterprise or the large media, brokers, large agencies, the big four, big five, they are driven by metrics rather than by results. And so things that cannot be measured in the short term, they will always suffer. If you don't go after the source, then you're going to have everyone in the middle trying to feed the system. So but now I stop rambling. So going to the publishers, do you think that's going to have an impact? Do you think they're going to get away with this current consent or pay model?
Just to flesh out the war on drugs analogy a little more. So what we have now is lots of companies chasing metrics, as you say, lots and lots of data being processed to produce quite poor quality results in quite an intrusive way. I mean, it's a bit like the kind of cheap street cocaine or whatever that you get when you leave everything to the black market. And I suppose advocates of reform in that area of law would say if you regulate and you allow some, some selling of narcotics or in the open by pharmaceutical companies or whatever, you have less harm in the long term. So not to overextend the metaphor, but when you look at the privacy guidelines recently from the EDPB. They basically went point by point and completely demolished a lot of quite earnest, in some cases, attempts to create privacy preserving tracking methods that are a lot less intrusive um, than what we currently have. But the idea really is to circumvent the consent requirement. So people that dismiss, for example, as well, Google's efforts with the privacy sandbox, I do think that being too hardline on this stuff leads to bad outcomes. So I I would like to see a little more understanding that we are where we are with the internet. You know, it really does run on personal data. That's the economic model. I don't think we're ever going to completely move away from that. And I don't think people want that, because they don't want to have 50 different subscriptions running for every website they use. So the compromise would be allowing some privacy preserving technology to develop where people frankly are tracked without their consent, but in a way that is not attributable to them as an individual. Now, there are academics in particular that hate that idea, because that kind of turns privacy into mere confidentiality. So you'd still have people exploiting personal data, but even if it didn't have any kind of harms on an individual privacy level, I don't really buy that as much. I think that we could get to, I mean, we should be encouraging a stage where businesses are able to use personal data, but trying to limit the intrusiveness and the harmfulness of that. I mentioned Brave earlier, Brave browser. When I don't use it, actually, I notice how bad people's experience must be on Chrome, because it just ads everywhere. You know, we are now 1,339 partners, opted in, legitimate interests, all this stuff. So it has got to a terrible state, and I'm sure the marketing, well, I know that the marketing industry is struggling to get meaningful metrics now because of the, you know, Apple's processes and people using VPNs and so on. So maybe there is a compromise to be reached where we don't have to charge every user X dollars per month, but we also respect their privacy just a bit more.
Yeah. It doesn't have to be binary. And that's my problem with consent, but we've said that before. I also think if we really want to ponder the risks, if we really want to think what's the risk of us being profiled, and we can look at the future. And I do worry about some risks. I know that some of these data points mean nothing today, but I can see how in 10 years they can affect my children's choices. I can see that because governments are buying from data brokers, and because some people are putting data together in new innovative ways that make us more predictable. So I can see that. But at the same time, I can also see, I've seen the evolution of privacy enhancing technologies in ad tech. And it's true, they can get to levels of aggregation that make it quite innocuous. And we're rejecting them just to favor the status quo, simply because it's not rewarded. Taking a risk is not rewarded. You need consent anyway.
Yes. Yeah, I
Yeah.
think that the fact that the privacy directive is so old, I mean, it's not old, but it is out of date. I think there's general consensus on that.
Only 22
Yeah.
years. Yeah.
I mean, the 2014 was the last significant amendment, I guess. And a lot has changed since then. And I think just being a stickler for compliance with that is counterproductive and won't help anyone, because there's always going to be millions of businesses trying to get away with not complying with it. We just have to accept that. I don't really want that much money to go into data protection authorities, but they could enforce the law against all those companies. There's other things to worry about. We've got hospitals to build. It's just impossible, I think, to really achieve 100% compliance across the board. So we need to think of another way of doing it. And I think some, for example, do not track type protocol, requirement to de-identify as far as possible, maybe a reconsideration of the scope of what personal data means, even in certain contexts.
Yes,
Would
yes.
be a better way of achieving improvements to online privacy.
Also, I mean, you already said that with big tech and large online platforms, there's a differentiation. When we go after the open market, I think we do not appreciate that enough. In the open market, so where publishers are playing, it's normally large advertisers. The small company cannot play that game. It's very sophisticated. You've got all these brokers in the middle. So if you want to bid for ads on the Guardian and you're a very small player, it's not that easy. And if you're a large media company, yes, it'll be part of your planning. However, you will go on Instagram, and many direct-to-consumer companies only exist because of Facebook and Meta and so on. The problem is that on the Meta side, even though there may not be so many parties and less risk of feeding that machine of fake metrics and so on, and performance does work, there's another problem which should be addressed separately, which is a competition problem, which is the one platform where all these small companies, yes, they can build a business, but they're basically working for Meta. But that's another story for another day. It's not a data protection problem. And we're trying to mix it all up. And I think that's part of the problem. I think it's a good idea to have everyone around the table. But then when data protection authorities are trying to enforce something that they cannot, that is not part of the GDPR or e-privacy, but it's just some sort of separate policy, it all gets convoluted.
Yes, it is not my area really, but I guess that's what they're trying to do with these kind of quasi competition laws like the DMA and the DSA. But they don't interact elegantly with the GDPR's enforcement framework. And we're going to add the AI Act to the roster now. We're going to have DPAs overseeing
Yeah.
a lot of that. It's not getting any simpler for businesses.
Yeah. So, Rob, what's exciting for you these days? Last question I'll ask you. What do you think is exciting as something to look forward to? Because everything is a bit pessimistic these days. We see that no matter what we do, first, it's impossible to comply. We already knew that. This was a risk-based world. Fine. But second, we cannot be relying on enforcement to make the world a better place. If the community itself, if data subjects, an audience, consumers are not really rewarding companies that comply, we do not see that. Companies receiving fines every single week, they are not suffering in terms of brand equity or in terms of customers. It's not work. That's not happening. And it's not going to be on the DPA. So is there anything positive that you're looking forward to in this space that could really make everything better?
Yeah, I mean, I am quite kind of cynical, but also an optimist, if those two things can coexist. So I think since I started thinking about this stuff in, like many people around 2017, 2018, there's been a huge shift in how the larger platforms are approaching it. I mean, they are spending a lot of money thinking about it and doing stuff. The cynic in me says, well, yes, it's spending money on avoiding it, but nonetheless, it's increasingly important to many, many companies. I really do see that, and there is an earnest attempt, even at somewhere like TikTok. I know people in TikTok that really do spend a lot of time thinking, how can we please the EU and stay on the right side of them, while also pleasing the board and trying to get users on board and so on. So I think that the culture is shifting. I think things at least have the potential to improve. I'm not sure how far that has happened in digital privacy, but there are things that are moving in the right direction, I think. And enforcement is not, like you say, is not the be all and end all. The Irish DPC is under new leadership that is proving to be quite interesting, actually. They are going for a more conciliatory approach with the EDPB. They haven't upset anyone yet since the two new commissioners came on board. They've requested some opinions and stuff. They seem to be, that could be very interesting to see what happens there. If the EDPB and Ireland are on the same page, it's going to present a new opportunity, I think, for better regulation in Europe, at least. The AI Act that I just mentioned there is a bit of a mess and will require a lot of work for many companies. But also, I mean, the more I think about it, the more I appreciate that it is coming into force. There is some important stuff in there. Again, I'm quite cynical about it. There's a lot of ambiguity, but I think some of the rules actually are going to seem increasingly sensible. Some of them might seem a little bit hysterical, and some of them are quite vague, but I think there's a framework there for meaningful regulation of high-risk AI systems. And when it comes to areas like immigration, judiciary, prisons, and so on, we do need some pretty strong protections, I think. So there's a lot to be positive about. Like I say, I'm skeptical about most things and cynical about some, and can be quite rude about certain organizations, but I think there's scope for meaningful change, and some of it is happening.
Thank you for the insightful overview, Rob. Thank you. Thanks again.
Great to talk to you as always, Sergio.
Okay, that's all for today. Please follow the Masters of Privacy channel on LinkedIn if you want to find some interview transcripts, cheat sheets, and other useful resources and surprises every now and then. On top of that, episode notes and other feeds are available on mastersofprivacy.com. Thank you for listening.